So now we are going to look more at investing in AI, and we are really pleased to introduce Alex McCracken from Silicon Valley Bank, who's going to give a talk on those latest investment trends for AI.
Hello, I'm Alex McCracken, Managing Director at Silicon Valley Bank in the UK, and we're a bank and lender to technology companies. In this presentation, I will outline investment trends in UK AI companies. But first, let me state how we define AI, as it's a rather broad term. Some people define AI as where computers mimic human behavior, but this is rather broad. Machine learning and deep learning are subsets of AI, where complex statistical modeling and neural networks are used. We therefore prefer goal-directed adaptive behavior by computers as being a clearer, narrower definition of AI. Turning to investment trends, we're seeing AI startups everywhere. In most verticals, i.e. industry-specific applications like health, finance, transport, retail, and every sector that uses data. These are what we call AI applications. We're also seeing enabling technologies at the bottom of this screen. These are the underlying technologies that can be used across many sectors to improve analytics and make predictions. So we're seeing startups in AI process technology, the specialist chips to process massive volumes of images and data at ever faster speeds, as well as companies offering natural language and computer vision solutions, customer relationship management solutions, AI statistical models for others to use, and all the areas shown at the bottom. So turning to UK AI investment, looking at the graph on the left, we see £10 billion of venture capital was invested in UK tech companies in 2020. And of this, around 15% or £1.5 billion went into companies using AI into 161 different companies. The chart on the right shows that these UK AI companies that received investment have actually raised £4 billion in total over the last few years in multiple investment rounds. Around one quarter of this was in enabling technologies versus 3/4 or £3 billion into sector-specific application technologies. So looking at the sectors that have seen most new AI companies, we can see in the pie chart on the left that cybersecurity, health and fintech are the top 3 sectors in the UK adopting AI. But pretty much every sector now has at least one, if not more, AI companies serving it, from mobility and new forms of transport to HR to all the sectors shown on the right-hand side of this chart. Some UK companies have received hundreds of millions of funding and have grown rapidly and are now valued at way more than £1 billion. Companies such as Darktrace, Sneak, Onfido, all in cybersecurity, Graphcore in new semiconductor chips for processing AI data, and Babylon, Lumira, and CMR in health applications. This shows the strength of the UK AI sector, and these companies are set to float or be acquired at large valuations, which should increase the strength of the UK AI sector still further. But it's not all about big companies. Investment continues to flow, even during COVID, to newer, smaller AI startups as well. Last year, we saw companies in all these sectors receive their first seed investment checks of £1 to £2 million to get started. But some UK and European AI companies have already been bought or floated at significant valuations. For example, Mobileye in Israel, which provides software for autonomous vehicle driving systems, was bought for $15 billion by Intel. And JFrog, an intelligent repository for complex developer code, floated at $6 billion valuation. So this bodes well for additional exits for UK AI companies, which may get bought or float at multi-billion valuations, which return significant capital to their teams and investors. So turning to more sector-specific trends, financial services like banks and insurers will see massive savings from using AI to automate repetitive tasks and data analysis currently performed by humans. AI will lead to better predictions, which will ensure best fit financial products for customers. We see huge savings from automation and AI in three main areas. Firstly, the front office functions dealing with customers are using AI in areas such as conversational chatbots, biometric identification of customers, and delivering personal insights to improve customer-facing processes and deliver a better, more personalized customer experience. Secondly, the middle office functions, which process customer information, use AI to prevent fraud and monitor compliance with regulations. Thirdly, the back office uses AI to improve analysis of applications by customers for credit and financial products to ensure better decisions are made for lending or offering tailored financial products and delivering relevant contracts to customers. The second major area application for AI is in health. Investment in Europe in AI health applications is more than 1 billion euros per year, and this is likely to rise, especially given the current pandemic. We're seeing the rise of investment in patient interactions, drug research, diagnostics, and robotics, all of which improve patient outcomes. We sometimes hear concerns that AI is a threat to jobs, and in some cases where humans are processing low-level data in repetitive tasks, then yes, these will be replaced with AI, automation, and robots. However, AI is a broad and complex area requiring high-level skills. So we are seeing the rise of jobs and skills such as thinking and leadership, as well as technically focused jobs, from digital strategies and marketing to more technical computing jobs in machine learning, data science, and automation. So positive news for people applying in those areas. So lastly, what do investors look for when assessing an application from an AI company for funding? They typically need to see things like the company solves a big, previously unsolved problem, something that existing competitors in the space aren't really tackling, and that they have a team that knows about this area and are experienced in delivering AI solutions, which can be incredibly complicated. Thirdly, that the company can access data on which to run their AI algorithms. Getting data and ongoing sources of data is crucial. Fourth, the company has a unique approach with a clear differentiation over others, which means they offer end customers a much bigger benefit or advantage than incumbents. So probably a 5 to 10 times advantage over existing solutions. Also, this means the company has a defensible moat or a barrier that prevents competitors from easily replicating what they do. And ideally, the company should be scaling fast, either growing revenue or potential revenues and customers with trials and people adopting the solution. So a whistle-stop tour through investment into UK AI companies. Clearly, a lot of exciting areas being invested in, and we look forward to seeing how the future unfolds.
Hi there, Alex. Thank you for the keynote. That was
Hello.
Excellent keynote. Good to see you again. Alex, let's kick off with some of the questions we've got. So, Firstly, you showed a graph of some of the big areas of investment since 2015 with health and fintech and other areas. Are there any areas that you're seeing that is particularly growing fast right now that are expanding, maybe, like surprising you?
Yeah, sure. So in particular, we're hearing a lot about demand prediction, particularly consumer demand prediction for new goods. So clearly, the pandemic disrupted or changed a lot of the buying behavior of consumers. Moved to online shopping, certain items at certain times. So we're hearing a lot of big corporates, particularly those that supply the goods or supermarkets that stock the goods, are wanting AI solutions that help them forecast demand better. So as an example, we're talking to corporates who are looking at data sources from social media, from some of their consumer customers, passing that with e-commerce browsing and online search terms to try and predict more accurately in more real time the frequency of buying of products, and then matching that to everything from the weather conditions to COVID tiers when that was a thing. So for example, if they're seeing a lot of people commenting about lack of toilet rolls in a particular area, then they know exactly how many toilet rolls to stock based on the number of comments and all the other external factors. So that kind of consumer demand prediction, I think, is only on the rise, because maybe this won't be the only pandemic, but it certainly won't be the only external shock that we get and corporates get. So we're seeing a huge interest in that area. Absolutely.
Thank you. And I just, is there anything else just to build on that as we emerge out of this pandemic? We're hoping to be emerging from this pandemic. You talked about health, and obviously you talked about that consumer market, and that as kind of registering as a kind of a big area. Are there any other sectors that you're looking at that either surprise you or not, but that you see as the next kind of big area for investment?
We're seeing an awful lot in insurance. So we've had a lot of AI adoption in banks and mobile banking apps and that kind of thing.
Okay.
But hitherto, insurance has been very much old world way of doing things, old world way of underwriting. So again, I think the pandemic showed that things can change very quickly. And insurers are now starting to work out, using data and then with AI models on the data, how do they offer insurance to, whether it's consumers or businesses, at point of purchase, or only when the consumer or business needs that insurance for a certain period, for a certain cover. Making it much more personalized and tailored to the duration and cover that those people and businesses need. Now, clearly, the everything that the pandemic's shown is all old data, all past models can be very quickly disrupted and need changing. So a lot of insurers are having to go out and get new sources of data, new, and not just the traditional things that they used to underwrite, but also then adding in other factors. So if the economic conditions change in a particular country, or a policy changes from a government in a country, as well as weather changes and all various factors considered, then they're able to better offer a more tailored insurance package.
That's really interesting, actually, because I think it wasn't last year, But not long before last year, I was having a really interesting conversation with a startup who had an idea in terms of how you could determine the risk profile of an individual from the way that they might even use their phone, and the metadata on their phone would give a kind of a psychological profile for the individual. And they were translating that into, would that be useful for an insurance company in terms of assessing the risk status of that individual? But I think what's implied in that is kind of there's a whole ethical discussion then that kind of it brings to the fore. And we had a fascinating keynote from Maria earlier in terms of the kind of the ethics around AI. Do investors consider the ethical impact of the AI companies when they're looking at investment opportunities?
Absolutely. So there's a classic case in financial services where the past data set showed that loans had been predominantly made to male-led companies. And because the data had only got that as a source, and there was insufficient amount of, people, different personality types, profile, demographic types getting the loans, the AI prediction said you should only lend to more male companies and male-led companies, and therefore only too late when loans were being issued and advantageous preferential terms were being given and detected in the real world being offered to male-led companies did people notice there was an enormous amount of bias in the original data. So clearly now investors have woken up to that. You can't just take when a company pitches you what they say about their data. So two things. Firstly, you can ask qualifying questions which uncover whether the company has done due diligence on the data themselves, are completely comfortable that they have considered a range of possible parameters, made sure equal weighting's given to the right things, whether it's gender or location or whatever. But secondly, investors just aren't as technically savvy as some of the experts you've had in your forum here. And so we have to go and get external due diligence done by IT professionals who really understand this and can ask even more detailed questions to uncover, look at the data even, and work out whether it's sufficient to overcome bias.
Fascinating.
I wonder, Alex, if data, you mentioned data is one of those key things when you're looking at a company as well for investment. And you've mentioned a couple of times the weather. So you talked about it in insurance, you talked about it in some of the sort of real-time provision of consumer goods. We've had talks on agriculture earlier. We've had talks on energy. So all of these things point to weather. I'm just wondering whether, that's a particular example, but are you seeing particular sources of data becoming more and more valuable, and therefore the companies that are using those sources of data become more valuable and more interesting to invest in?
Yeah, to be honest, there is an awful lot of interest really in trying to get more first-hand consumer data, first-party consumer data. And what that means is what people are doing online. And clearly those areas are being tightened up, particularly in Europe, but also now in the US. So large corporates are trying to get more of that through permissioned apps. So if you've given your consent to usage through those very complicated terms and conditions that nobody reads, corporates and end users are still trying to get hold of that data. Because all the external ones, the weather, the publicly available sources of information about travel, they're already known and already got. So it's just more and more data about the individual. Now, the ethical companies gather this in the right way, and they make sure the data is anonymized and aggregated so that they're spotting patterns in a mass of data rather than identifying the individual. And therefore, again, we as a bank are using third-party IT consultants to make sure that data that we have that's very sensitive gets anonymized in the right way, so that any external AI solution can analyze it in aggregate, but without then detecting the underlying company or individual it refers to. So we're seeing the rise of those intermediate solutions that clean data, aggregate data, serve it up, make sure it's all anonymized, and then bigger data sets can be added to it, and therefore better insights theoretically should be derived.
Can I ask a question?
Okay.
Sorry. So one of the areas of research that we're working on is around the exchanging of data. So can you create effectively a trusted ecosystem where people bring their data for the benefit of the ecosystem as a whole, but the value that's extracted is so much more than the data in its own sort of silo right? Do you think across the organisations that you're working with that that's a possibility to kind of create those trusted ecosystems that will bring their own data to the benefit of that entire community?
Well, firstly, I think that trusted pools are vital, because you need to have trust that the organisation such as BT looking after the data, or maybe a big systems integrator, whoever it is, but they're a trusted name. They've been storing big pools of data for themselves and third parties already for many years, and they're cognizant with all the regulations around it. So that's just a gating checkpoint. And so I think a lot of these AI companies that are very narrow and very niche in their solution, and maybe have got hold of a proprietary data set, or maybe they're just working with a handful of customers who open up their own small part of their own data set, they will not scale particularly well, because they train their models on that particular data and the taxonomy of it and the use case of it. Whereas to do a massive data pool, gather in third-party data from a lot of different sources, make it all harmonized, and fill in any gaps. It's a huge job, as we know, and So I think that can only exist with likes of a BT and a corporate that is able to handle it at scale and make sure all the checks and balances are done before you even then point an AI tool or several AI tools at it in order to drive some insights. And I think this is an area that we ask a lot of AI companies pitching us is, okay, fair enough, you've got some algorithms that predict X, you've got a data set that does Y, but how do you scale that? Because the next person you go on to will have a rather different data set. Even if they're in the same industry, they may call things by different names and different labels, and your algorithm might not necessarily work. So I do think there's a massive place for the pooled aggregated data that's then different tools could access. But we're only seeing a handful of organizations do that.
Interesting, very interesting. Thank you.
And so you talked then, Alex, about those companies pitching to you. I wonder if you could maybe give us some examples of some of those ones that you've recently invested in, perhaps, and some of the core reasons why you did so.
Sure. I can't disclose names because we don't have the specific permission, but in terms of telling you roughly what they do. So the first one is in cybersecurity, specifically for financial services and banks. And they monitor the way that consumers log in to access accounts. And so firstly, they study what device or location or approximate time, or even the time spacing between pressing the keys for their password. And then if the consumer logs in next time in a slightly different way, maybe from a different device, but same location, but with a very different pattern to pressing the keys for their password, it will escalate and ask for a second factor level of authentication from the consumer. And then clearly, if the consumer logs in from a different country in a very, very different way from a completely unknown device, then they will ask the consumer to verify, call in to verify. So it's a very neat way of using, with the consumer's permission, their patterns to detect whether it is likely to be that genuine consumer logging in. So fraud and anti-fraud, it's a huge area for any financial services or even e-commerce business or anyone transacting online. So we think this area is going to be huge in terms of anti-fraud solutions, using AI to defeat hackers, just because the sheer volume of people logging in and transacting and sheer volume of data exchange, you need AI to track all that. So, why did we like it? Excellent team that came from the industry, knew what the problem was first, then hired techies who really knew what they were doing to solve it. So some engineers from big tech who really knew about algorithms within financial services. And then clearly it's a growing market and a big market, and probably only going to grow exponentially. So we liked for all those reasons. But then, clearly we could use it ourselves. So that was another key factor. So that was just one. Another is in credit decisions. So when we assess loans into businesses in our particular case, it's very manual. We have to gather a lot of financial information and then talk amongst ourselves, and based on past patterns, we can work out whether to lend and how much to lend. Now, clearly, we pointed AI at a lot of our past data and fed in also how those loans performed. So we trained the model to say, can you replicate how we make a lending decision? And we are now starting to augment the humans in the decision making by saying, well, the AI system says, based on these parameters, you should or shouldn't lend. Now, when we were training the model, the algorithm originally was starting to make errors. It was saying, you should lend here, whereas clearly in hindsight, when we look back, the loan performed badly and it wasn't repaid. Or the algo would say, you shouldn't lend, whereas actually we did lend and it performed very well and the company grew. So we were able to tweak over the last year the model and train it so that based on look back data, it was starting to predict exactly how humans and the company had predicted. So now going forward, we're using that to augment our human decision making. So it's not left entirely to the AI, it's not left entirely to the human, it's a blend of the two. So it remains to be seen how that grows, but that's a classic case of we had to train that a lot. It was very time intensive. It wasn't an off the shelf solution we could just drop in and immediately away we go, it works. And so it's a different example of something we not only financially invested in, but took time to invest in to make it suit ourselves. And I think that's a key distinction here between some drop-in AI solutions that take, known parameters, make decisions, and they get going pretty quickly, versus some things that are much more bespoke.
Perfect.
Have we got
Alex?
time for a quick one?
Oh, just about run out of time, but
it was
really
the
quick.
skills one. Sorry, I just wanted to get this in. So when you were talking about, AI taking the place and the machine learning taking the place of that kind of more mundane kind of menial task level, and that actually what we're seeing is that the value chain in terms of the skills is increasing. I just quickly, sorry, do you, when you look at the landscape in terms of building those skills in those areas, do you think there's more to do for us in the UK, or how do you feel? How comfortable do you feel that we're driving that?
Well, I feel we're getting there, but clearly we could always do with more AI trained engineers. We could always take more managers who are not necessarily deeply technical, but then know how to not be scared of AI, but use it as making better strategic decisions. So I only hope that the rise of STEM teaching in schools and further education is on the rise. And I know the government is very keen to talk about this and has even committed some money. So let's hope it continues.
Thank you very much. Sorry.
Excellent.
Thank you.
No, Alex, that was great. Thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate it. Excellent talk.
Thank you.